What a wonderful opportunity to be with everybody, and what a fine job that Atlantic Health Systems did. Thanks to Chris and Gloria, especially Ashley and David behind the scenes controlling life and technology. I've been wondering about and working with adolescents for the almost 50 years. And I heard today and heard previously some lines that really resonated with me. We heard Dr. Alderman talk about culture trumps theory. And how can we bring ourselves back to what we used to do of neighbors helping neighbors, of people being in caring relationships with each other. I talked this morning about another quote that I always love, reality astonishes theory. And so we're in an awkward time where we're devoting our attention to the new deity, which is science, and sometimes have forgotten the things that got us here, which really were about people in relationship with people. And so I want to talk about a story that is relatively old and is in some ways our collective shared sacred story. It's been said that when we get our story wrong, we get our future wrong. And I would submit that the most important story that we need to get right is how we educate and help our children come of age. And if we haven't gotten that right, then we haven't gotten our future right. And I would suggest, as Dr. Anderson has pointed out and others throughout the past 2 days, and all you have to do is read the news of the day, that we haven't quite gotten the future right. And my focus really has been in trying to figure out what does it take to raise healthy young people who can feel a sense of connection and belonging, have a sense of meaning and purpose through an identity that is grounded in their community, in their culture, in the stories of their ancestors. And so I uncovered, and not surprising since in my history, we celebrate rituals of passage, especially around the time of coming of age, that for 30,000 years of evolutionary history, rites of passage has been significant in the way we help people through transition. But I want to tell the story in a little bit different way. So rites of passage, when I talk about it, may not be familiar, or you may think about it in a different way. And I want to talk about it in a precise way called youth and community development through rites of passage, which is really reciprocity, which is the natural orientation for things. So think about what it would be like if we didn't have funerals, which is a rite of passage, or marriage, which is a rite of passage, or birth ceremonies, which are a rite of passage. You'd probably think, well, that's kind of crazy. And in a sense, thinking about funerals, someone passes away, and you'd have to do something with the body. Just a fact of life. You'd also have to do something to act as a container for the emotions of losing somebody. And so funerals and these things called rites of passage came up in the service of helping sustain and help individuals and communities adapt, as much as, especially in the coming of age and initiation ceremony, rites of passage help the transformation of young people to adulthood. But one of the difficulties is, in contemporary form, in contemporary Western society especially, we've had rites of confusion. If you Google rites of passage and you put in media, you'll get over 100,000 different uses of the term. This one up here was taken from one of the headlines. I still don't know what it means. Rites of passage: romping, sniffing, exploring, weigh-ins, baths, fill, calf's day. But if you do a Google search, you'll come out over and over again with these misuses of rites of passage. And what were really rites of passage about? Some suggest that any first kiss, first date, or first cigarette, anything that happens for the first time is a rite of passage. And while it may be memorable, it really doesn't fit with what the definition of rites of passage is, as first brought to our attention over 100 years ago by Arnold van Gennep, who is a Belgian sociologist or anthropologist, and he wrote a book published in 1906 called The Rites of Passage. That was the bilingual portion of this presentation. And he essentially, because he was an ologist, a sociologist or a psychologist, he had to take something that is actually very simple and make it complex. And rites of passage is essentially honoring that everything, especially things that are major, have a beginning and a middle and an end. But because he had to make it fancy, he said there's a period of separation, there's a period of transition, and then there's a period of reincorporation. But what we have found, which is very disturbing for me, is that today we've actually compartmentalized rites of passage as a program. So we take young people out of their community and they have a transformative event, and it's very powerful, and they talk about it being a rite of passage, and then they go back home to their family, to their culture, to their community, who has no idea what they've been through. And so I like to ask 3 questions relative to rites of passage. Initiation into what, by who, and for what purpose? And as Van Gennep and others have pointed out, and we all know intrinsically, that rites of passage is really about the initiation into our community, into our culture, into remembering the words of our ancestors. And it's by people who are actually in our lives and will be in our lives. And it's for the purpose of reciprocity, in that you are coming of age and being given the gifts of adulthood by your culture and community, and at the same time, your responsibility is to give back. And so somebody, a young person, said when asked, well, how do you know you're an adult? And she said, when you have something to teach others, or when you have something to give back to others. So when we think about rites of passage, I talk about youth and community development through rites of passage, and the exemplar is the Rite of Passage Experience Rope, which I was fortunate to help co-evolve in the 70s, experimented with it in a juvenile reformatory in Connecticut, and then went on as a director of a municipal-based human service organization for 15 years to experiment in what I talk about as a laboratory of grace for what this story of youth and community development could mean for a community. Not only as it impacts youth development, but as a story that resonates for people and can bring people together in community. Now, one of the important things, and this is a long story, and I have a few more minutes than 5 minutes, but not enough to explain it all, I want to talk about one of the major utilities of having a culturally sensitive and community-oriented rites of passage is that it really addresses the onset of puberty, and for a young person, massive changes that are going on. It affirms that changes are happening physically. It's affirming that changes are happening mentally. It's affirming for a young person that their mind is changing, and I'm going to get into that in a few minutes, and that they're beginning to wonder about who they are and their place in the world. In fact, I had a brand new ally that I'm so happy about, Kevin DeGrasse Tyson, who's the new astrophysicist, director of the Hayden Planetarium, and he says, I don't understand how any young person can come of age and have an identity without understanding the story of the universe, and how when they look up, they don't wonder what are those things twinkling. They know it's the stars, and they are, in fact, the product of 13.5 billion years of history. And so at that time of coming into an awareness of yearning to wonder about who they are, I always say the Great Spirit has a sense of humor because typically parents are entering midlife. And so what you have here, which our ancestors clearly understood, is a collision of transitions. While the young person is wondering, who will I be when I grow up? Their parents are wondering, how have I been doing as a grown-up? And so what we understood and why community-oriented rites of passage is so important, that story of transformation and transition gets to be shared between the parent and the child. And it is important also to recognize that the period of separation is about to begin. So, in the story of coming of age and initiation in a community rite of passage, the parent and child begin to have the conversation about the beginning of the end of childhood, and that certain roles and responsibilities will be anticipated, certain skills and competencies will need to be developed, but the parent role has to change. A child cannot have their adulthood emerge in a home and family that still treats the young person as a child. The family system has to change. One of my mentors, friends, founder of the field of community psychology, Seymour Saracen, said, who is also a founder of our agency, that ritual in general and rites of passage were our first attempt at a community psychology. And so when the community, and especially at the level of the family, has a story of rites of passage, they realize that something has to happen as the child reaches puberty. We also recognize, because we're merging tradition and technology, to note that in a social development model of youth development, that young people come of age within a number of different environments. They come of age within their home, within their peer group, within their schools, within the community, and I would suggest also within the nature and the natural world. And within those environments, they need to develop skills and competencies to live well, to feel comfortable and confident, and have success in those environments. And so each of those environments gives us an opportunity for the initiatory process to unfold. We talk about youth and community development through rites of passage, beginning around puberty within a whole community, and we've done this in communities, especially in Connecticut, but the guiding principles for youth and community development through rites of passage have spread around the world. And we recognize that as young people enter puberty, they really want to explore what are their gifts and talents, what is their bliss. And so as young people enter middle school, the challenge is, as they begin separating, how can they find their bliss? What can they do to engage in play? Secular spirituality, as I say. And the other thing is, service is the rent we pay for living in our community. And as young people come of age, a characteristic of adulthood, as I said before, is being able to teach someone something or give back. And so if we have a culture within a community who embraces the story of rites of passage that emerges as their story, it's not a program. It's an emergent design process for people to come together and develop their rites of passage, then high school students actually help mentor young people coming of age. It was said earlier, and in the discussions over the next couple of days, we will never have enough resources to pay the people to provide the services that we think everyone needs. But we can help develop the capacity, especially for young people who are looking for meaningful ways to be in their community, to be of service and help others. And so youth and community development through rites of passage really is a reciprocity between the individual and community. We say that a young person's identity is being able to integrate their culture, their community, as part of their identity. It's not just something that happens mentally in the absence of context. That's the difference, I think, that I've learned between clinical and community psychology. And so let me talk a little bit about this magical time of adolescence. Having worked with adolescents for almost 50 years, I have to think there's something about adolescence that has to serve survival. Nature designs intentionally for survival. And why does there seem to be, especially in Western culture, this propensity to label and diagnose young people as oppositionally defiant, and they're not likely to go along with a lot of adult edicts? What if there was some evolutionary purpose for that? Well, in fact, we have just uncovered in neuroscience that the adolescent brain is different than the brain of a child and the brain of an adult, and they even call it the adaptive brain. Now, we have to think in evolutionary terms, coupled with this notion of a community organizing process around rites of passage, what's the purpose of adolescence? If not, through the initiatory process to help communities adapt. Because traditional initiation rites, and even those that I went through, have adolescents actually look at our values, our ethics, that inform and guide expectations for behavior and challenge us whether they're still useful or not. There's never been a greater impact in tobacco cessation as when they began tobacco education in high schools. Because the last thing you want to be is a parent who smokes when your teenage son or daughter has come home from a tobacco education class and starts wagging the finger talking about how stupid you are for smoking and don't you know. But it's indicative of the place, potentially, the potential place of adolescence to serve evolution through the process of rites of passage. Now, I want to talk a little bit about one aspect of this. When young people participate in the work of the community and giving back, which is a characteristic of maturation and a sign of becoming adult, it's something they really can contribute. I worked recently for 3 years with the federal government, with FEMA and emergency preparedness. Think of what could be possible if teenagers were prime partners in civic engagement for civil preparedness. What kind of opportunity and meaning and purpose would young people gain by being a central resource to help communities in times of natural disaster? That actually, because I've worked with indigenous people and people in Polynesia and around the world, that actually is the rightful role of teenagers, because they just happen to be the strongest among us. And I don't know about you, but being older, I'd like to have some teenage males living next door to me when my lights go out and I need some help because a tree has fallen on my house. So one of the things I work with communities all over, and we work not specifically around rites of passage. For me, the interesting and unique factor of rites of passage, it can be a unifying story for all the other stories. So many people are familiar with developmental assets and character education and collaborative for academic and social emotional learning. But when we engage communities in thinking about the principles of rites of passage and helping the community recognize that when young people become partners in policy and programming, it can really help communities adapt. Here's a picture of a community I work with in Connecticut of a proclamation for young people with the mayor, the superintendent of schools, the chief of police, that every board and commission within town government and within the school has to have a team of young people who are full partners, and a whole process that goes into that. When we talk about rites of passage, I have seen, and it has been experienced by many others, that it can really be a unifying story to bring together the typical siloed spectrum of service delivery, from prevention to identification, treatment, and aftercare. Because the story of rites of passage is really the story that children want to know. They want to know, what is the pathway to adulthood? How do I get there? It can also be a story that engages young people as co-researchers in therapy that's actually reframed as part of the ongoing process of initiation. Therapy isn't done to children who are mostly unwilling, as a therapist for a teenager for decades, but they're brought in as co-researchers in the ongoing process of rites of passage. Now, at the end, I just want to show a brief illustration of what we mean by initiation within the concept of academics and public schools or private schools. I was telling somebody the other day that, in the early 80s, we had Just Say No as the public policy. It was the story for drug abuse prevention. And they were like, no. And because I'm a little bit of an antagonist, I said, well, if that could be the story to prevent drug abuse, I'm going to have buttons made that say, just be happy for depression. I mean, it should really work. So this is a small segment of how a community adopts the Rite of Passage story around academics. So we start off teaching young people in a group, and it's typically high school students that are doing this. These are young people in 6th grade, and we teach them how to use a compass. Well, as it says here, the same skills and attitude that it takes to learn how to use a compass are the same skills necessary so you don't get lost in math, science, social studies, and the like. And here we have high school students who are actually eliciting what did it take for you to learn how to use the compass. And it's an interesting evaluative measure that when we do this with students who are underperforming in school, they may only generate 40 alternative solutions about what it takes to learn how to learn well. But you can take a homogeneous group of young people, they'll come up with 60 to 80 different attitudes and skills of what it takes to learn how to learn well. They commit this to a student scholars plan. The most important thing is the bottom. They make a commitment signed by a high school student, their teacher, and a parent on the things they need to work on to do well in school. The focus is on being a scholar. Well, that's all well and good as an adulterated idea. It's an idea. But what happens is that the students stand up in front of their community, in front of their whole school, read their scholars plan, make a scholars pledge, and all those people who were part of the initiatory process help them meet their plan, because that's what they've committed to do. And we're not about being punitive, we're about being positive and helping students achieve what they've committed to. So this is the initiation of scholars, which is a little piece of how the story of Rites of Passage can fit into a community. So in closing, I want to suggest that this is just part of an emerging story. It's not a program, but it uses the emerging design of people in conversations within a community, thinking about what the guiding principles are for youth and community development. And we think about problems cannot be solved at the same level of awareness that created them. And typically, we're very, very problem-focused, and that through experiences, we can really help young people experience a story of coming of age. So we say it takes a whole child to raise a village, and when we share in the story of Rites of Passage, the village can adapt and survive into the future. Thank you very much.